Good morning to our guests in the room, those of us joining online, and most especially all of our panelists. As you know, this panel will explore various considerations in completing the transition of the remaining switched access charges to bill and keep, an effort the Commission began in the 2011 USF ICC transformation order. We have an excellent set of panelists with us this morning to help us explore these issues, and we have a lot that we would like to cover. So without further delay, I would like to invite all of our panelists to introduce themselves and give us a brief overview of your organization's position on the key considerations in completing the transition to bill and keep. And I think we can just start going down the line with Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Morris from NCTA. We represent the cable industry. Our cable operator members have been very actively engaged on these IP transition issues and intercarrier compensation issues for many years. These are two important transitions that are taking place. They've both been going on for decades, really. I think with both of them, we're at the end stage where we have the hardest issues left, which is why we have 2 days of panels to talk about all this. It's important to keep in mind we're doing these, as Commissioner Trusty said, because the end result is to benefit consumers. Getting to an all IP environment is something that our companies have been pushing for a long time. Our members provide voice service in IP. We would love it if when we get to that point where everybody is all IP and all traffic is in IP all the way through, that will be a great thing for consumers. I think it's something we want, and we're happy to be part of this process of working through these issues with all the other stakeholders. The one thing that sort of jumped out at me yesterday was, and we heard it from Commissioner Trusty today, but from Chairman Carr yesterday, that the importance of the fact that the Commission has decided that we are going to complete these transitions, and it's really now just a question of how to finish the job and what the implications are. That's a level of resolve we haven't necessarily seen in the past from the FCC, and which is why we're talking about an order from 2011 and finishing that transition. To me, that's a really positive sign. I think the engagement we're seeing on all these panels is a positive sign. So we are really looking forward to being part of the discussion and trying to get to an all IP world and a bill and keep world, and doing that as efficiently as possible.
Thank you. My name is Jim Lennon. I'm here representing Inteliquent. My role in Inteliquent is I'm in the product management group. I oversee basically our access products. I've been at Inteliquent for about 8 years in that organization, managing access products from the revenue side. But previous to that, I was in cost management jobs in various CLECs. So I've seen the transition of access charges from the 2011 order to now, from both sides of the shop, both the cost management and the revenue management side. And so we come to the table with that kind of unique perspective. Inteliquent is probably the largest independent transit and aggregation provider in the U.S. We're basically what I would describe as a carrier's carrier. We don't have end user customers per se, but our customers are most of the carriers in this room that we're working with here. We come to this on the record. We have a proposal, which we call our NTP proposal, National Transit Provider, that I look forward to discussing on this panel today, that we think is the best and fastest way to get to where I think the outcome is that we're all trying to get to, which is a full IP interconnection architecture. And again, we don't look at that as an adversary of other things on the record like the allies. We think it's complementary to, and it can be a transitionary to something like the allies in an end state down the line. But we believe that our model is the only way that we can get there in the 2-year period that the FCC has laid out. I look forward to discussing that more on the panel here And again, I also want to thank the FCC for putting these panels together. I think it's a good forum for everyone to lay out their positions, their line of thinking. But then I think the real work is after these panels, collaborating as an industry on what the right answer is. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Roger Nishi, and I'm General Manager at Waitsfield and Champlain Valley Telecom in Vermont. And I'm here today representing NCTA, the World Broadband Association. Thank you to Brian Ford, one of NCTA's fine lawyers, in helping me prepare for today. Thank you, Brian. I'm also here on behalf of all the rural ILECs in the U.S., like Waitsfield and Champlain Valley Telecom, that serve very high-cost, lowly populated areas. I'm here to ensure that our customers do not experience rate shock, that we can continue to innovate and bring the latest in technologies to the areas we serve, and to ensure that our rates remain affordable for the customers we serve. I'm really proud to be part of the rural community and the community that are the companies that I'm representing today. I truly believe that our communities are better because we're there, and we want to continue to be there and make a difference for all the customers that we do represent. Thank you for having me here today, and looking forward to today's discussion.
Good morning. My name is Randy Clarke. I am an attorney in Verizon's Federal Regulatory Group, and let me start by thanking the FCC for putting this workshop together. I think it's a great way to dig into the issues, and thank you for including Verizon on the panel. I look around the room and I'm in awe at the expertise of folks that are here now that have been working on this issue for decades. Verizon has been a part of that process and is looking to continue to be part of that process. Let me see. The question, Peter, that you asked us is, what are our positions on some of the main issues in play? And so I'll touch on a few of those. We appreciate the Commission's focus on transitioning to IP. We appreciate the Commission's recognition that the intercarrier compensation system and what's left of it is part of the solution. And so looking at those things together, while it makes for some headaches and late nights, is the right thing to do. And so we have been. And we've been looking at what exactly is the goal and what is the problem, what are the obstacles. And through that, we've come up with and contributed to the creation of the Allies proposal that my colleague Jim just mentioned. We think that proposal, which would provide a pathway for carriers who are not yet exchanging traffic in IP. And I'll note that a lot of traffic is already carried in IP. Much traffic exchanged between larger carriers is exchanged in IP, but a lot of traffic, and all the traffic is important, is not yet carried in IP. So we looked at that situation and created a way where carriers could, if they want, connect directly. We created a proposal for this. Carriers could connect directly, or if they didn't want to do that, they could use internet connections that they already have to send voice traffic, to declare a location to exchange voice traffic without going through the process of individual negotiations with every other provider. Now, what were we addressing here? We were addressing the fact that there's about, roughly 1,000 carriers. And if they each have to negotiate an IP interconnection agreement with each other, that's 1 million agreements. It's a lot of agreements. If instead you say, if you don't want to do that, you can follow some rules. Now, these rules are important and they're specific. How will you exchange traffic? What are the technical details? Where will you do it? How will the security work? How will the encryption work? But if you follow a template of rules, you can say, okay, here's where I will receive traffic, here's where I will exchange traffic, and we'll work according to the rules. Everybody else who's following that rules will also be able to exchange traffic. That's the agreementless part in the agreementless IP exchange over the internet, the Allies proposal. We think that will fast forward the process of everybody exchanging traffic with everybody. You don't have to do it that way, but you can do it that way. We also think that model leverages the existing internet so that concepts that come from the public switch telephone network, concepts that come from past decades of work in this area, like where are the points of interconnection? Where are the transport links? Where do I have to haul my traffic to? Fade away, because the edge becomes your internet connection. The point of interconnection becomes your internet connection. It's not Wild West internet. It's encrypted. It's authenticated. It's a session that's initiated with signaling protocols so that carriers can talk to each other. But anyway, we think that is a path forward. We think a transition is necessary and appropriate. And Jim, I appreciate the thoughtful and thorough work that your organization has done putting together a proposal. There are other proposals in play too for how to get there. But anyway, glad that we're here. We think that getting to an IP transition is very important and appreciate the Commission's focus on it and the rapid timelines proposed.
Thank you all so much. I think that's really actually provides a nice framework for all the things that we want to cover today. But I want to start with a question about incentives that brings in a couple of thoughts from yesterday's panels, which was that there was some discussion yesterday suggesting that the current intercarrier compensation system incentivizes the maintenance of TDM networks. So I'd like to ask each of you to weigh in on the extent to which you have found that to be true or not. And I'm happy to start with Steve again.
Yes, to some extent. Again, it's important to keep in mind that these two transitions have been going on a long time independently of each other for good reasons. We started talking about bill and keep and phasing out access charges like when I first joined the commission 25 years ago. The week before I got there, they started a proceeding on intercarrier compensation, and there was a paper on bill and keep and why that was the most efficient way of doing traffic exchange. So we've been talking about that for 25 years now. The commission adopted that 15 years ago, totally independent of the IP transition, but they did it because that was the right thing to do for like phasing out access charges made sense. Separately, the IP transition has been going on for decades. We heard Commissioner Trusty talk about all the consumer benefits we're going to see from that. Is there some like resistance to retire equipment because people are collecting access charges? I think there's maybe some of that's playing into things and maybe slowing things down and is like yet another reason to get to bill and keep. But even without that, we have plenty of reasons to finish the transition to bill and keep and to finish the transition to IP. So I think it's just a question of getting it done. And we've got now these proceedings teed up to do that. We're almost there. We just need to keep plowing ahead.
I think there's probably some relationship, right? There's a relationship between the intercarrier comp and certainly the speed of how quickly we transition to an all IP interconnection network. And one of the things I should have said in my openings that one of the distinctions I think that's made on the record, we want to make sure it's clear. I don't think there's much objection or argument about this in the record, but is that besides the intercarrier compensation piece that we're looking at and trying to decide the migration of it to bill and keep, that those are the charges that the originating and terminating parties share with each other. I think in the record, there's plenty of folks who have clarified that there are carriers like us, intermediate providers, who both now and after the transition, it's acknowledged that those are valuable services in the ecosystem and that those charges are not ones that we should be looking at reducing to bill and keep either now or post-transition, as those services are separate from the intercarrier comp that the originating and terminating parties get from each other. So that being said, in our proposal, we look at the relationship of intercarrier comp to all IP transition as, yeah, let's take advantage of that link and let's actually incent folks to move faster. So meaning the folks that are still getting intercarrier comp in a solution that we put together, can we incent them to move to IP faster and not lose that immediately upon converting? Maybe even a system that the earlier you convert to IP, you get to hold on to that a little bit longer, because there has to be an acknowledgement that in moving from TDM to all IP, it takes money, it takes capital. So you can't burden the folks that you're asking to make this transition by reducing the amount of revenue and capital that they have access to while you're asking them to convert. So can we put together a final proposal that incents them financially to move quickly. And we think the NTP proposal does that. And to me, it's that the combination of the NTP proposal and some incentive for folks to move quickly, we believe it's the only thing that we can do that will meet the 2-year window. Again, the Allies proposal, we're part of those ADIS conversations. We don't object at all to direct interconnection any way that two carriers want to agree to do it. We just think that putting all of the specifications together, the rules or whatever, and then implementing it across 1,500 carriers is going to be something that won't be able to get done in the 2-year window. So we introduce our option to cover that transition period, basically.
There's not any incentive. There's zero incentive because of the access charges. If you take a look at the universe of NTCA companies, 88% of them have IP switches. 55% of them, or about half, actually have IP in their networks or provide hosted services either through their ILEC operations or their competitive operations. All this rides on fiber. 86% of the NTCA members have fiber networks. So it's not incenting the companies to not invest in IP. We've invested in IP. But when the carriers don't come to you with an IP, then how do you get the IP out of your area? Currently at Waitsfield and Champlain Valley Telecom, all calls within our network are IP to IP. Calls that leave our network are transferred to TDM before they leave our network, so they can leave our network and hit the tandem. I'd come back to the NECA tariff. Since 2013, it's had a service called Ethernet Switched Access Transport. If carriers would have purchased that, we could have had IP leaving our networks and our calls could be IP from beginning to end. Now, that being said, if it hits a tandem on the other end that isn't IP, it's going to be transferred back to TDM. So, as I've said, there's no motivation whatsoever in terms of this. We would like to get some IP connections because it's more efficient and our guys are experts with our IP switches. When I hear people say we haven't invested or we've held up the transition because of access charges, that's farthest from the truth.
Thank you for the question about incentives that access charges create. I'm happy to hear everybody on the panel agreeing that the incentives aren't holding up the transition. I want to identify a few. It's access charges themselves that are providing what we consider to be incentives that keep some traffic from moving and keep some entities in the ecosystem focused on staying on TDM. And those incentives are the revenue flow that access charge represents. It can prevent an entity from moving to an IP system because that would make an access revenue flow go away. And what I'm talking about here is the access revenues represent an implicit subsidy, whereas something like universal service is an explicit subsidy where the commission decides, okay, here's how support's going to work. We will explicitly subsidize certain services. And the commission has an elaborate process and has done great work creating explicit subsidies where necessary and has been working, as Steve mentioned, for decades to wring implicit subsidies out of the system. They were created for a reason. They were created at a time, but the reason for which they were created, those conditions are by and large gone. The problem with an implicit subsidy, and that is an intercarrier payment that one carrier makes to another, is that the commission doesn't have great visibility into it, doesn't have great ability to target it. It's a blunt way to get the job done. Another problem with it is an entity can design a network, an opportunity, a scheme to maximize that revenue flow with calls or calling patterns designed specifically just to create those flows. And many of us are familiar with access arbitrage that has happened over the past decade, and I applaud the commission's efforts to stop access arbitrage, to curb access arbitrage. But that moves at the speed of regulation, and arbitrage schemes move at the speed of creativity and innovation. And so there's still some left. There's less, but the continued existence of arbitrage, and these aren't small amounts of money, it's still tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, incent providers who are in receipt of the revenue to continue to be in receipt of the revenue. If you take that away, the efficiencies of moving to an all IP voice exchange become visible to everyone, and it's easier to get there. So we think those incentives are still in play, but I appreciate and have read the record on the percentage of rural carriers who have fiber, who have made the investment, and look forward to continuing our work towards IP interconnection.
And I welcome companies to approach the rural ILECs and take a look at why there are still access charges. Take a look at the IP access charges. The Ethernet switch access transport service is described as tariffed IP interconnection, SIP-based, bidirectional, and it's been available since 2013. So we are not the holdup.
Thank you. That's all extremely helpful. Roger, if I could pick up on something that you said with regard to the rural LECs and having already invested, at least on your end, into a lot of these technologies, there is some tension in the record that tends to suggest that moving intercarrier compensation to bill and keep might actually delay the IP transition further. And if we've got a lot of the rural LECs that have already made those investments, that would tend to suggest, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that would not cause a delay. So I was wondering if you could maybe drill down a little bit and help us resolve that tension to the extent you can.
I think it comes back to where companies really are in the continuum of where they've invested in their networks. Those that have invested already have used the access charges and the ICC universal service to invest in their networks. Those that haven't, they probably haven't done so because they have an older switch technician who's comfortable with what they've had in place, and they haven't purchased a new one because they haven't seen a need. Why invest in an IP switch if I'm going to convert everything to TDM before it leaves the network? So I do believe that's kept some companies from the process of investing in those switches. For sure, if access charges go away, it will slow the growth. The money won't be there for everyone to get to TDM or to an IP network as quickly as possible. And for those that have invested in their networks, the funds are still valuable resources for them in the maintenance of their networks. It's provided the funding for us to do cybersecurity on our networks. It's provided the funding for the whole IP fraud detection, stir shaken. So the money that's come has helped us to do other things within our networks.
Yeah, building on that, I think some of the trickiest issues from the network perspective are not really on the ends with originating and terminating, because as Roger said, I think most companies are IP. Where we see the challenges are in the middle, where we've set up arrangements where a lot of traffic gets exchanged at TDM tandems. There are, someone said yesterday, like 1,600 tandems. That's the first time I've ever actually heard a number of how many there are, because it's not really tracked. A lot of those are places where you have multiple carriers connecting, coming in and exchanging traffic. Those facilities are going to be retired at some point, and that traffic exchange has to happen somewhere else. And that really is the heart of what's left of the IP transition, is figuring out, okay, how are we going to exchange traffic if we don't have those tandems to do it at, and those arrangements that we've all made, that we entered into decades ago after the 96 Act, because that was the sort of efficient place for everyone to exchange traffic. And what you have seen from Jim's company, Randy talked about the US Telecom proposal. These are just different proposals for how we're going to exchange traffic differently from what we're doing today, and the transition that's involved in making that happen. And so that's really, like, from the network perspective, that's the hard part, and that's what we're working on. There are some stragglers who have not updated their local switch. And if Roger's right, then if we figure out the piece in the middle, that will be the thing that gets the stragglers to say, yes, now is the time for me to upgrade my switch. So it just shows, like, all these things are interrelated, and the commission thankfully has teed it all up, but we're going to need to get to resolution on a lot of different things because they all tie together.
Thanks, Steve. And so I think this is a great conversation, and I would offer that, again, Inteliquent's proposal of the national transit provider what that proposal is to become that new piece in the middle that can foster an all IP environment and replace what the TDM tandems are doing today. So we already do this today. It's just a matter of that we don't have all 1,500 VSPs connected to us. And again, when I say us, there could be multiple national transit providers, but the idea is to get all 1,500 connected to someone who can do what we do today. And that allows basically the entire exchange of traffic across everyone's network to happen in an IP environment in a very short amount of time. We were here for panels yesterday, and I think the other proposals out there, they're a lot of good ideas, but a lot of things that are still in the planning process and unproven. And so our idea is we can get there faster with our proposal, allow these other things to continue to be discussed, continue to be hatched. But exactly what Steve's identified as those tandems needing to be replaced, that's what our proposal does.
I agree this is a critical conversation and hitting on some of the key issues, but I'll throw out another issue that I think is a key issue. Over the last century, voice has been recognized as important. Ubiquitous voice communication has been the work that this commission has done. It's been available everywhere, and a lot of equipment was custom developed to make that happen. Tandem switches and office switches, trunks, the protocols for making that all happen, a separate network just for voice. That got us through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Then stuff happened and there was regulation and here we are, but a separate network for voice. We don't need that anymore. And so we shouldn't build another network just for voice. We have an internet. It's really good. It got us all through COVID on Zoom. Separate discussion, separate conversation, but we don't need a separate new network just for voice. And I would argue we don't need a new regulatory framework just for voice. That takes us back into a regulated space rather than forward into the IP future. And so it's, I think, really important to think about, like, what are we trying to do and what do we need? Can we leverage the internet? Where can we leverage the internet? Where can we leverage the communications network that we have and that people are using? And to just amplify that, 95+% of people are not using the public switch telephone network for voice. So we don't need a separate network for voice and a separate regulatory framework for those last 3%. There are very important things that we do need, and I'm glad that the workshop is addressing the security, the public safety, but we don't need to regulate our way back into the solution that we're trying to leave. And so a solution that relies on sections 201, 203, 205, 208, 251, 332, and 10C, plus has a new setup of inter-entity, dare we say, inter-carrier compensation that has formulas and some of our favorite things like true-ups. It's worth a look to say, do we need that? Or can we leverage the communications network that we're already all touching and using and have a less regulatory but effective, secure, and safe approach?
That's super helpful. So I'd like to also talk about, you've all now talked about the exchange of traffic, and these issues, of course, intercarrier comp and interconnection are so closely related. So I would like to talk about sequencing for a minute. And there's some disagreement in the record about how the commission should actually approach its proposed reforms to interconnection and then its proposed moving access charges to bill and keep. And I know that there's some of you on this panel even have put that in your comments. So I'd like to know your views about the proper sequencing of these reforms, if any. And Jim, you really brought this up, so I'd like to start with you here.
I would just say, in thinking about the sequencing, what I think we need to be careful of is, again, the issue on intercarrier comp is we're discussing it mainly to drive towards the overall goal of getting the IP interconnection or getting the interconnection network to all IP. So if that is the goal, and I think that is the goal, I think most people on the record would say that would agree that's the goal, we should be careful that everything we're doing here with the intercarrier has that goal in mind. And we're not just looking to reduced to bill and keep for no reason. The purpose is to get to an all IP interconnection environment. And so again, I would bring up that we should be thinking about ways to do that, to incent folks to move to all IP. So I think that's the only thing we need to caution about. See, I understand that they're two different orders, but we have to think about the reason we're doing this one is that the larger goal is the all IP interconnection network. There are some things in the record about billions and billions of dollars tied up in these duplicative networks that are out there. And so the goal of all of these processes should be to get to an all IP environment and free up those. So the ICC is part of that, but we have to do it in a way that we're ultimately looking at the bigger goal, which is getting to the all IP environment.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead.
This will take 5 seconds. What Jim said.
I would just maybe contradict a little bit. We started talking about bill and keep even before we started talking about the IP transition, and there are reasons to do it independent of the IP transition. We're way past time. The commission adopted it 15 years ago, said this is the right way to do this. We'll have a transition period, but we need to get it done. The rest of the IP transition has a lot of really complicated issues. It'd be nice if we got it all done in 2 years. I think there's a lot that's going to have to happen. I think we'll make some big decisions in 2 years. But I worry a little about saying, now we can't do bill and keep until we get everything else done. And all of a sudden, it's like we're another 10 years down the road and we still haven't done it. Let's just do it. If the consequence of that is that there are companies that think they need more universal service money, that's a discussion that can be had, and we can talk about it on this panel. I know there's another panel, but ultimately it's really a subsidy issue, and we can grapple with that, but let's end the access charges.
For the rural ILECs, it's a situation of we really need to know where the interconnection points are going to be. As NTC proposed, 50 end offices, each one in each state, or if not one in each state, possible regional ones. But in any instance, I think the edge remains where the edge is today. We should not be responsible for having to pay to transport our traffic outside of our areas. And I know that goes against everyone whenever they hear IP, because when it's IP, everyone pays at IP locations in 5 or 6 cities in the U.S. So that's very important, because if we have to transition to bill and keep, if we phase out the ICC and at the same time do things to the ARCs and other end user charges, those are all revenues that could go away. And at the same time, if say that $17 circuit that Bridget Reardon talked about yesterday becomes $44,000 a month, that's $44,000 a month that is outgoing and not producing any revenue for us as a company. So it's a direct turnaround. And if that happens, it will be very hard for us to maintain and innovate within our networks.
Thank you. So everybody at this point, I think, has mentioned the transition. So I'd like to move to that.
I can start with that.
Okay. I would like to know your thoughts about the 2-year transition the commission has proposed.
2-year transition is way too short, especially if you're doing everything simultaneously. We have budgets and we plan on investment, and it could turn budgets around. Those that need to invest in an IP switch, it could slow that process down. And if things get cut in 2 years, I wonder what those companies that have large loans, how they're going to react to the banks when they don't meet their ratios. So there's a lot that comes into play if a transition occurs in 2 years. That's why the U.S. Telecom proposal, 11-year proposal, freeze for 5 years, then 10% for the next 6 to 8, and then 22.33% in years 9 through 11. It makes sense because it's spreading out the revenue reductions, and therefore we can plan our spending and what we need to do within our companies in that amount of time. Now, I would have one suggestion on this. I really do believe at some point in the 6 to 8 years, the overall compensation needs to be looked at because some companies may not have the financial wherewithal to go completely to zero in the 11-year period. There could be some type of form of universal service that helps them maintain their networks, and they may not be able to afford to go to zero as suggested in their plan. Did I answer your question?
You did, absolutely. Anybody else want to weigh in on the transition period?
Which transition period? We have a lot of transition periods.
2 years to move to bill and keep.
Oh, yes. We should do that. Sorry, Roger, but we should do that. We were supposed to be there already. It's time. We have exceptional situations like Alaska, which is always different and should be different. But this isn't a surprise that we're talking about this. People should have been planning for this. Again, as I said before, if there's USF implications to that, that's the discussion we should be having. Our view on it is the world has changed since we set up all these programs. There is so much more competition in rural areas. When we set up USF 30 years ago or even 15 years ago, there was very little competition in rural areas, if any. And we were trying to get service for the first time to people, but now there are options, and that's relevant, and that should be relevant in the amount of money that the government spends in these areas. We shouldn't be spending in areas where private entities have built facilities. Mobile was just beginning at when we started. Now everyone relies on their mobile phone, and that's relevant to how much the government should be spending on USF and supporting rural companies. We should be looking at rural consumers, and yes, if there are places where there is no option but the rural telco, then let's figure out what the right amount of subsidy is. But that's a much smaller universe than it used to be, and we need to reflect that in our USF program.
Roger, I'm glad you mentioned the U.S. Telecom proposal. I agree there's a conversation to be had about explicit subsidy support going forward. Like, what's the goal? What do we need to get there? And to take a look at that. So that, I think, is a continuing conversation. I think in terms of transitions, I'm going to help myself to answering both. I think the IP transition is job one. The 2 years is ambitious. We're looking straight at it. And I've talked about the Allies proposal, and there's bridge proposals to get there. And I think job two is the ICC and revenue side of it. And we should do that too, but we shouldn't slow down job one.
Yeah, I agree. We shouldn't slow down the transition. 2 years is ambitious, so it could go a little longer, but that's really the key to this. The whole intercarrier compensation, I believe that it can go much longer and continue much longer. If it happened in a 2-year period, the customers in our area would be looking at a $19.80 increase. I'll put it this way. When I'm out mowing the lawn and my neighbor comes by and his truck stops, and I try to ignore him and looking down, he'll sit there until I stop. And the next thing I'll hear about is fine Vermont butt chewing on how $19.80 a month rate increase isn't affordable. So that's why I think we need to take a look at the transitions, make them longer so that rural customers don't have rate shock.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to now move to transit, because I know we've talked a lot about transit. And Randy, I know Verizon has argued in his comments that bill and keep is incompatible when it comes to transit providers. So I'd like to first get a sense of the role that the transit providers are playing, and then the way that the commission can ensure that the rates for those services will remain just and reasonable without the need to prescribe specific rates.
Thank you. That's another key issue that I'm glad we're focusing on. So the role of the transit provider, and I think there is a role of a transit provider here. And again, the compliments to the thoughtful and thorough NTP proposal, which looks at what's out there, who's doing it, what could be done, how could this get us to the future. The role of the transit provider would be to carry off-net traffic. So one provider originates it, the provider in the middle carries it, it terminates to someone else. So the role of the transit provider would be to carry that traffic. A couple of things. A rate for that is different from an intercarrier compensation originating or terminating access rate. It's different because a valuable service is being provided across the middle of the network, and it costs something to provide that service, and it's valuable to the entity receiving it. So To Verizon, those charges and the ability to have a transit charge are different from the rest of intercarrier compensation charges and should be preserved. There's details around which exact transit charges that I think are beyond the scope of this exact forum, but there needs to be one. Another point on transit charges that I think will be important in this conversation is who are the cost causers and who are the payers. And they should match. If you have cost payers separated from cost causers, that's the recipe for arbitrage. And we'll be back here talking about it if that happens. That would happen if a system is set up where a carrier elects to use a transit provider. So a terminating carrier elects to use a transit provider to receive their calls, and there's a rate for that. If a customer of originating provider picks up a phone, makes a phone call to that originating provider, that originating provider doesn't have an arrangement with the transit provider, but under some proposals may end up getting charged for it. So you have the cost causer separated from the payer. Somebody could set up a traffic flow to make that happen a lot and have a lot of charges go to the originator who's not in on it, didn't agree to it, didn't order it constructively or otherwise. So I caution that we be careful about setting up a system that keeps the payers and the cost causers the same. To translate that, somebody electing to use a transit provider, and I think this will happen in many cases. It doesn't make sense for everybody to interconnect directly. Somebody electing to use a transit provider has to pay for originating and terminating traffic going from them and traffic coming to them. So that's a point to consider. In terms of keeping the rate reasonable, again, there's a conversation to be had. The rate has to work for everyone. And so that's an important detail that we need to work through.
And part of it is related to the point Roger was raising before about where the network edge is, because it has to be clear what people are responsible for. And if my job as an originator is to get traffic to some interconnection point, then I would pay a transit provider to do that. And that's my responsibility as an originating provider. If the edge is somewhere else, then maybe it's going to work differently, but it needs to be clear how those responsibilities fit, because otherwise, as Randy was saying, you're going to end up with arbitrage situations. It's the whole point of bill and keep and doing a lot of these things is to end those. So that's where certainly clarity from the commission will come in as to network edge and how transit will work. There's a related question. Jim, your proposal, I think, would have the FCC very actively regulating that transit function, maybe more so than today. And there's a question of whether that level of regulation makes sense, or whether, I think Randy was getting at this before, is that really what we're trying to move away from and get to a much more unregulated environment, or lightly regulated look that looks a lot more like what we have for the whole rest of the internet.
So let me just respond to that, because I think that this conversation is certainly very important to Inteliquent. We've thought about a lot of these things in our proposal. I mean, we're not looking for a, strict regulatory regime. We've suggested light oversight, and for that light oversight to be only during a transitional time frame and then reevaluated. And the reason for it is some of the things that Randy's brought up. And in the past, being the carrier's carrier, being in the middle of so many calls, we understand arbitrage and we want to get it out of the ecosystem too. So I think some of the things that we've introduced in our proposal do that. Learning from the past, we don't want geographic specific rates for transit service. That's something that has fostered arbitrage over the years. We want a same rate for everyone, no matter where you are. So that takes away some of the historical incentives to arbitrate, to put numbers in certain areas of the country and drive traffic to that area. One of the reasons we're asking for light oversight is we want a public notice on the rates so that they're fair and reasonable. We don't want NTP number 1 charging X and NTP number 2 charging Y. Again, we think that deviation in rates is something that fosters arbitrage. So we're asking for light regulation during this window. Also, in our proposal, we identify how we would set up. We will get within 100 miles of any RLEC. or within 2 miles of the ILEC tandems that exist today. So we try to lay out a lot of these things in our proposal, and we think it's important that during this transitional process that there is some oversight to it that allows it to happen in a way that's fair and reasonable for everyone, ubiquitous. Again, in order for it to work, right, we need everyone connected to an NTP. So we need that governance too. We're not asking for a long regulatory regime that would go on forever. We're asking for just some oversight during the transition that will help make this work and make it work for everybody. Because in order for this to work, in order for us to get to a full IP integration, we've got to get all 1,500. There can't be 5 or 10 or 15 that don't make it. So we have to find a solution that's going to get all 1,500, right, into that IP interconnection ecosystem.
So would you have the FCC set those rates? Is that the idea? And how
So
would
I
they,
think what we
how would they
suggest-
know what's reasonable?
We've suggested like a public notice where people would look at it from a cost perspective. People could comment on it, but it would be through a public notice.
For the RLECs, we just want to make sure that our network edges remain where they are today through this whole process.
I'll just note that the emphasis and the desire for light regulation, we share that. Read with some concern from parts of the NTP proposal that talked about setting 3 new tariff elements using Section 203 in a way that I think would make Section 203 shudder a little bit, and then using the tariff process to implement those, and then having the commission's backstop to prescribe rates. I think that section would also come off the shelf in a way that's not been seen. I think there's a way to get here, but that level of regulatory involvement, I think, is a step in the wrong direction.
I think it says something that the two people who worked at the commission doing pricing issues are both recoiling at the idea of the FCC setting rates.
It's because there's no one left in the tariff division.
So maybe it's not a great idea.
The tariff division is alive, has deep experience, and just a shout out to you all.
Sorry about that.
So we actually did start a little early, so we're going to keep this going just a little bit more. I do think the network edge is critical, as you've all acknowledged. So I'd like to get some input on your perspectives about how the commission should, or the commission or the states, or whatever combination of those two. And there's a big difference between defining the network edge during the transition and after. And I think that's a really important distinction. So I'd like to get your input on the network edge issues, both during and after the transition. Whoever wants to take that, because I think everybody's had input on that.
I'll take a swing at it. So after the transition, I'll start with after. I think this raises the question of what are we building, and do we need a separate network and a separate regulatory structure just for voice? I don't think we do. And so I think there's a fair cause to evaluate, look at, do we need network edges? Are there still network edges? Or do we use internet connections that we have, augmented if necessary and as necessary, to exchange voice traffic? And so in that way, the network edge becomes a fully qualified domain name that a carrier identifies and says, this is the web address, essentially, where you can send me traffic and I'll use it to send out traffic. Not Wild West traffic, but authenticated, encrypted traffic and a session opened up. But in that way, the concept of an edge, and I understand concerns about building transport across the country to 8 data centers or something like that. You don't have to do that. You use the internet connection you have. During the transition, I have a little bit of a concern about building something new for a couple-year transition that's going to be taken right down. And so another approach is that as TDM traffic falls away from the network, as people interconnect, the problem gets smaller. I know that's high level in general, but conceptually, I would caution against an elaborate new regulatory structure to handle what I think we're all trying to turn into a relatively short-term transition.
I think it's really a question of, are we going forward or backwards? And Randy said it before. I think we don't want to go backward. We want to go forward. And we have the internet, which works without a network edge at every rural telco or in every state. It does amazing things. We somehow need to be taking advantage of that. And the fact that every company that provides voice service, or almost every company, also participates in that traffic exchange at far greater volumes. Yes, it's different. Voice maybe requires something slightly different, but somehow people get their traffic to interconnection points that are outside of their territory, and it works really well. And there's no reason that can't be part of the solution for voice as well. And if you're going to make every provider go set up a new interconnection point in every state, I think that's problematic.
So I just want to push back a little bit about that we're building an entirely brand new network. The transit network that we would see running the NTP largely exists already today within Inteliquent. We would need to build out to some places that we aren't, but it's not building an entirely new network. And I would just go back to, with all of the work that started with the allies, and it's great work, but I think we still have a lot to figure out. And I think Inteliquent's view is just, we see this probably going more than 2 years, and maybe significantly more than 2 years, to get everything developed, everything pushed out across the entire network. And we think our solution is the quickest way to get to the all IP as quick as we can. That's what we're trying to do, to take advantage of, so that we can tear down these dual networks. And so we just think it's faster. It gets where we need to get quicker. And then it's also, we see direct interconnection continuing to happen over time, but this solution would always be there as a backup, as a default. And so a lot of it's about how quickly do we think we can really get where we need to get. And we think the Inteliquent solution gets us there the quickest.
Anybody else on that? Nope.
For the rural companies, it really just comes back to, if the edges do move, we just do not want to incur substantial expenses that we don't have in place today, because once again, that will put pressures on the affordability and our local rates.
Thank you. So I think we're just going to wrap up now. I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to just provide any concluding thoughts you have, anything you want to leave the audience with today. And I guess we can go in reverse order. So I'll start with you, Randy.
Well, thank you, Peter. Again, I'm just really glad to be part of this. I'm really glad the commission's focusing on this. It's an important set of issues, and this is a good way to raise a lot of them in discussion collaboratively. A couple of points I want to leave with. I would commend to anyone interested here to read a short letter that AT&T put in the record recently, proposing another way to bridge from where we are to the Allies' proposal. I thought it was creative. I thought it leveraged existing things. It would have owners of tandem networks provide IP interconnection to subtending carriers. And in that way, it's very similar to the network structure of the NTP proposal. And in ALATA, it would have the opportunity for forbearance from the TDM obligations and requirements when all of subtending carriers are IP interconnected. So that is another way that's out there, and I thought it was a creative idea. I'm glad it's part of the record. I also wanted to note that there was a line in one of the comments that I think is worth addressing that described efforts as a trust us, it'll be fine approach. And the amount of work that's gone into creation of the Allies proposal that's been discussed, obviously to the NTP proposal, it's not a trust us, it'll be fine and we'll work it out when we get there. Standards bodies are engaged. And that's a long and laborious process because it's thorough and it's necessary. But it's not, oh, we'll figure it out. It's being figured out. So good and necessary work is underway at ADIS. Good and necessary work is underway in the development of the various proposals. And I think that reflects the importance of this issue and certainly Verizon's engagement in it. Again, thank you for convening us and looking forward to continued work.
Once again, thank you for having us here today. If we could take a win away from this, I commend U.S. Telecom and their 11-year transition. We could all agree on that today and go away with a win, and we'd be happy. And at the same time, add that little look in to see if every company should actually go to zero over the last 3 years. Anyway, thank you for your time today.
I just want to thank everybody. Thank you to the FCC. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. And again, as I said at the beginning, I think these panels are great. They're a way for everybody to get the issues on the table. And Telecom looks forward to being part of the solution. It would be silly for anyone to think that any proposal that they've made is 100% the right way to do this. So the idea of getting everyone together here, going through it, and then the endpoint we get to may be a combination of things that are in 6 or 7 different proposals now. So I think these forums are a great way to get that out on the table. So again, we very much look forward to being part of the solution. And I think the one thing that Randy and I definitely agree on is that we should be working on it with an eye towards the overall objective is getting to the all IP interconnection. And so if we look at everything from that perspective and as quickly as we can also. So that's the perspective we're looking at it from, and we look forward to working with others in the industry to get there. Thanks.
I'll echo a lot of what everybody said, except for maybe 11-year transition. I'm sorry to deprive us of a win, but we're not quite there yet. But there's obviously a lot of really complex issues, interrelated issues that the commission is grappling with. I think it's great that you've done this set of panels, and we obviously have a lot of very engaged stakeholders who have already committed a lot of time and effort to this. I think everyone is ready to step up and continue working on it. We look forward to the next phase, which is really going to be working with all of you. And at some point, you all will need to make some decisions that then have ramifications, and we'll have to figure out if we do X, what are the consequences of that? As Jim said, no one's going to get everything they wanted. We're all going to be making compromises, and how that process plays out, I think we're all looking forward to being part of that and working with all of you at the commission on getting it done. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. This was a really great and informative discussion. So we're going to break until 11 and come back for the next panel. Thank you all so much.